Manny Pacquiao is a legend of the sport and goes in the history books as the only ever 8-weight world champion, winning titles from flyweight all the way up to super welterweight. What's crazier is that this is a difference of 10 weight divisions. He actually skipped super flyweight and bantamweight. This is an achievement that I can't see anyone beating anytime soon, or at all, if I'm being honest. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you've not been here before, I look at some of the greatest boxers of all time and rank the quality of their resumes using a scoring system. The way the scoring system works is like this. I'll use my cat as a template opponent. Each fight that the boxer has 3 criteria to satisfy, which will each be scored out of 10. Firstly, level. This looks at the level of the opponent's whole career, including after their fight took place. This takes into consideration their ability as well as their achievements. Secondly, timing. This looks at how informed the opponent was. The closer to their prime, the higher the score will be. The first and second criteria act as a 2-stage test to properly decide the quality of the opponent at the time of their fight. It's worth noting that competitiveness also plays a factor here. The more competitive the fight was expected to be and the more risk for the boxer being evaluated, then the score is going to be higher. Thirdly, performance. This looks at the in-ring performance by the evaluated boxer. If it's a shutout points decision, an early KO, or just a dominant all-round beating, then you're looking at full marks. Competitive fights can still score high performance marks if it was entertaining. Look at the recent Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. fight for example. Benn lost, but I thought he performed extremely well. So in theory, he could still get a high performance score. The level of opposition is not necessarily a factor here. It is still possible to score a 10 for performance against lesser opposition because the average is going to be brought down due to the other scores in this criteria already being low. These 3 numbers then give us one average number which tells us how good of a win it was out of 10. This is done for all the boxers' fights, including draws and losses. The average number for the draw gets reduced by 33%, and the average number of the loss gets reduced by 50%. Once we have all the figures we need, this gives us 3 outcomes which go into our 3 leaderboards. Leaderboard 1 is consistency. All of the individual scores from the fights will be merged together to create one overall average. This is known as the consistency score, which determines the average level of the wins. Leaderboard 2 is longevity. All of the individual scores from the fights will be added together to give a longevity score. This favours boxers that have a large quantity of wins, so if you like an active fighter, you might prefer this way of deciding who you think has the best resume. And leaderboard 3 is overall. This leaderboard is considered the most important by far. This incorporates everything: the amount of fights, the quality of the wins, the quality of opposition, quality of the timing, as well as the performance. To get this figure, we take the average quality of the opposition, plus the average quality of the timing, plus the average quality of his performance, multiplied by the consistency score, plus the longevity score. Here are the leaderboards for the 6 resume deep dives I've done so far. Alexander Usyk is leading the way on the consistency score with a score of 8.15, which is incredibly high. It's not a surprise because he is undefeated, he fights quality opposition every time and looks great doing it. Floyd Mayweather is top of the longevity leaderboard with a score of 252.21, despite actually having one less fight than Canelo, who is not far behind. And as it stands, Floyd Mayweather has the best overall resume with a score of 416.78, but let's see if today's boxer is able to knock him off that top spot. We will be looking at 41 of Manny Pacquiao's fights, starting at his most recent comeback fight against Mario Barrios last month, all the way back to his breakthrough fight into the mainstream media in 2001 against Lelo Ladwaba. I will be including 2 additional fights because they are too important to miss out. His knockout loss against Boonsai Sangsarat to lose his flyweight world title, as well as his win against Chatchai Sasakul to win the flyweight world title. I won't be including any fights in between these because it would be too difficult trying to put a number value on the quality of the wins because there isn't enough knowledge or footage available to form an accurate opinion. Plus, if these fights never happened, it wouldn't change our opinion on Pacquiao's career as a whole. Now without further ado, let's get into it. Mario Barrios often gets touted as a poor boxer, which I do understand because he does have flat performances and you can't really pinpoint a specific attribute of his that makes him good. But he is also a 2-weight world champion. But with that being said, when he retires, I think he'll just be known as the person who cheated Pacquiao out of being world champion again. So Barrios can have a 6.5 for level. Although Barrios wasn't considered a good champion, Pacquiao was 46 years old and hadn't fought in 4 years since losing to Yordenis Ugas. He did have a 3-round exhibition fight in 2024 against a Japanese kickboxer and essentially got beaten up for all 3 of those rounds. And if you saw any of Manny's training footage around this time, he looked horrible. Myself and many others gave Manny no hope for this fight with Barrios, and he was a big underdog. So this timing has to be a 10. Now I'm trying to take context out of the performances and just look at them at face value. For his age, Manny did extremely well, but not accounting for his age, he did okay. It was a close fight. I personally gave it a draw. I think people calling it a robbery are a bit blinded because they get caught up in the fact that Manny was doing better than expected. His ability to throw combinations was still there, but his footwork had slowed down quite a bit and he was getting caught too much coming in. All in all, I'd give this performance a 6.5. This gives an average of 7.66, but because it's a draw, it gets reduced by 33%, so the actual average is 5.11. Yordenis Ugas actually lost against Mario Barrios, but he does also still have better wins against opposition like Manny Pacquiao himself, Omar Figueroa Jr., Abel Ramos, and he was also a 2-weight world champion, so Ugas can get a 7.5 for level. In the build up to this fight, Ugas had beaten the likes of Omar Figueroa, Mike Dallas and Abel Ramos. Ugas was the WBA champ and Manny was coming off a 2-year layoff after beating Keith Thurman. Considering how good Manny was in the end of his career, he was underdog for these fights, so he can have a 9 for timing because he's fighting these guys at their peak when he is nowhere near his peak. The jab of Ugas was a big problem for Manny in this fight. He was struggling to close the distance as the fight went on, which isn't much of a surprise considering Ugas is about 4 inches taller. When he could get inside, his combination punching looked really sharp. I didn't personally score this fight, but I do feel like Ugas did the more consistent and cleaner work throughout the fight. This was definitely Pacquiao on the decline, and I'll give his performance a 5.5. This gives an average of 7.33, but because he lost, this number gets halved, so the actual average is 3.66. Keith Thurman is an extremely talented boxer and could have been spoken about in the same way that Crawford and Spence were spoken about, but he was plagued with injuries throughout his entire career. He still managed to secure great wins against the likes of Robert Guerrero, Danny Garcia, Sean Porter, Luis Collazo, Josecito Lopez, so I think Keith Thurman deserves an 8.5 for level. Pacquiao had just beaten Broner the fight before this and hadn't really shown much sign of slowing down just yet, and he entered the fight as a slight favourite despite Thurman being undefeated and holding wins over Sean Porter and Danny Garcia, but he was quite inactive in this period. Still a big challenge for Pacquiao, which deserves a 9.5 for timing. Manny knocked Thurman down in the first round, showing he still had pop in his punches despite his age. Thurman made this an extremely exciting fight and can likely have boxed a smarter way to get a points win, but he really tried to fight fire with fire and get up close with Manny. Pacquiao was tough and durable and proved he can still crack. It was another close fight, but it was one where Manny still looked like he had plenty left in the tank. I'd give this performance a 7.5. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. Where do you even start with Adrian Broner? I first watched Broner when he fought Gavin Rees back in 2013, and everyone thought the sky was going to be the limit for him. Obviously he did fall off pretty hard towards the end of his career, but he is still a 4-weight world champion, winning titles at super featherweight, lightweight, super lightweight and welterweight. But there's not that many signature wins on his record that have a wow factor, so Broner can have an 8 for level. Broner's 2 fights before this were a loss to Mikey Garcia and a draw against Jesse Vargas, so he wasn't on the greatest form, and 147 pounds isn't a weight that Broner has had much success in, despite that world title, but let's not count that. Broner on his day can still cause most people problems, it's just that his day is very inconsistent. I'd give this timing a 7.5. Pacquiao basically won this fight on activity alone. Broner was waiting and trying to counter too much, and I think he wasn't expecting Manny to still be as fast as he was in this fight because he was still getting tagged quite a bit. Manny looked much quicker here when you compare it to how he looked against Ugas 2 years later. Pacquiao had a really good second half of the fight and had Broner hurt in a few of the later rounds. All in all, Pacquiao looked really good in my opinion. I'd score this performance an 8. This gives an average of 7.83 out of 10. Lucas Matisse was a good fighter on his day and he carried scary power for someone his size. His best win was his icing of Lamont Peterson in the 3rd round, but when he stepped up to that next level against the likes of Zab Judah and Danny Garcia, he seemed to fall short, so Matisse can have a 7 for level. This fight was the last one of Matisse's career at the age of 35, which isn't really much of a factor considering Pacquiao was 39. Matisse had a mixed bag of wins against OK opposition and always had a puncher's chance, not to mention that Matisse was also WBA champion, so this fight made plenty of sense from a career path standpoint for Manny. I'd give this timing an 8.5. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the Manny Pacquiao we remembered. Multiple knockdowns, his first knockout in years, and a complete dismantling of a naturally bigger, dangerous puncher. For years people questioned whether the power was gone, whether the aggression had left him. Lucas Matisse got beat up badly. This performance is undoubtedly a 10. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. I have already scored Jeff Horn's level in the Crawford resume deep dive. His one and only win against a good opponent is this controversial decision against Pacquiao, and that's really all he's known for, so he gets a 5 for level. Horn was undefeated, but he hadn't really fought any great names, and most people, including myself at the time, hadn't even heard of him, primarily due to him only fighting in Australia. This was a voluntary title defense for Manny's WBO belt at welterweight, and you could maybe consider it a cherry pick gone wrong. This was a huge upset, and Horn on paper shouldn't have had a chance. This timing gets a 5. Horn made this fight horrible and scrappy and managed to push Manny onto the back foot when Manny doesn't usually like to do his best work, which is possibly why the judges gave Horn the decision. If you look at the CompuBox stats alone for this fight, you do question how it was even close, because Manny landed over double the amount of punches than Horn did. But when you watch the actual fight itself, it's much closer than you think. Not a good performance from Pac at all. I'd give this a 4. This gives an average of 4.66, but because he lost, this number is halved, so the actual average is 2.33. Jesse Vargas has a lot of notable names on his record, but they mainly come in the form of losses and draws. To actually find his best win, you're probably looking at his win against an old Humberto Soto, or his win against Antonio DeMarco back in 2014 to defend his WBA super lightweight title. Vargas gets a level of 6. Pacquiao was a heavy favourite for this fight, but Vargas had just won the vacant WBO title at welterweight by stopping Saddam Ali. There isn't really any other great wins on Vargas' record, and he also lost a decision against Timothy Bradley a year before, so I'm giving the timing of this fight a 6.5. Manny started this fight pretty well, but Vargas definitely grew into the fight as it went on, and was outworking Pacquiao in parts and definitely had his success. Pacquiao was getting hit more than he's used to here, and was quite lucky that Vargas isn't a big puncher. Not Manny's best work. I'd give this performance a 6.5. This gives an average of 6.33 out of 10. Timothy Bradley was a good world level boxer, but he was never anyone's favourite boxer to watch, even though he was usually in exciting fights. Make that make sense? If you asked someone 10 years ago, who's your favourite boxer, and they said Timothy Bradley, I would think they needed sectioning. He does still hold a win over Manny, controversial or not. Also a win against Marquez, Joel Casamayor, Devin Alexander and Lamont Peterson, so I think I'll put Timothy Bradley on par with Keith Thurman at a level of 8.5. This was the third fight between Pacquiao and Bradley, with them already winning one fight apiece at this point, so Bradley showed he has the capability of beating Pacquiao, kind of, because, you know, the one he won was a bit of a dodgy one, but although this was the last fight of Bradley's career, he is still a very active fighter. He had wins over Jesse Vargas and Brandon Rios the year before to win the WBO welterweight title, so I'm giving this timing a 9. This was a much more patient boxing performance from Manny compared to his other fights against Bradley. Manny seemed to be a lot more defensively conscious as opposed to the offense that we usually see from him. I'll admit that the offense did come in the latter portion of the fight because he dropped Bradley in the 7th and the 9th rounds, even if they were a little bit innocuous. A different performance from Manny, but still a very good one, so I'll give it an 8. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. I'm not saying too much about this, my deep dive video on this man says it all, go and watch it if you haven't already. He's obviously a 10 for level. You should already know on Mayweather's video I gave this timing of this fight an 8.5, and Pacquiao has to get the same treatment. Although Floyd wasn't in his prime, Manny wasn't either. This fight came late for the both of them, so I don't think it's too damaging to the timing score, so this timing can get an 8.5. Manny did better in this fight than I remember. Definitely didn't do enough to win like some people think, but he had his moments, but ultimately he was beaten by the slicker boxer, so this performance can get a 4.5. This gives an average of 7.66, but because he lost, this gets halved, so the actual average is 3.83. Chris Algieri was a world champion at super lightweight, but would you really class him as a world level fighter? I'm not so sure. His best win is against Ruslan Provodnikov when he won the title, but other than that, there's nothing really of note on his resume. Plus, he lost to every actual world level fighter that he fought, so he can have a 5.5 for level. Chris Algieri was undefeated before this fight and had recently won the WBO super lightweight title. Algieri was moving up in weight to fight at welterweight, but for whatever reason there was a catch weight in place of 144 pounds. I mean, I assume this would be more favourable to Algieri being the smaller man, but he is still moving up in weight regardless. I'd give the timing of this fight a 7. 6 knockdowns, although a couple of them were slips. Algieri got battered, not sure how the stoppage never came. It was target practice really, and you won't see much more of a one-sided fight that doesn't end in a stoppage. Every time Algieri threw, he was made to pay because Manny came back with 5 or 6 shots of his own. Algieri fought this fight with fear, and rightfully so, because clearly Pac was hurting him. I'd give this performance a 9.5. If he got the stoppage, it would have been a 10. This gives an average of 7.33 out of 10. Timothy Bradley again, and as I've already stated, he has a level of 8.5. This was the second Pacquiao-Bradley fight, and Bradley at this point was on the run of a lifetime. Obviously already beating Manny, as well as also beating Devon Alexander, Joel Casamayor, Ruslan Provodnikov, and Juan Manuel Marquez in the space of 2.5 years. This was undoubtedly a prime Timothy Bradley, so this timing can get a 10. This was a great scrap, as most Pacquiao fights usually are. The difference in style between this fight and their third fight is quite crazy, because this was all action. This was a good example of being in a close fight, but still performing very well. I do think that one judge's scorecard of 118 to 110 for Pacquiao is a bit of a joke, and I had it much closer personally. This was definitely Pacquiao's best performance against Bradley, and I think it deserves a 9. This gives an average of 9.16 out of 10. Brandon Bam Bam Rios won the WBA World Lightweight title and defended it 3 times, which is obviously very impressive, and the lightweight division was stacked in this era, but Rios didn't fight any of those stacked fighters, so I'm giving Rios a 6 for level. Rios was coming off of a loss, as well as moving up in weight from super lightweight to welterweight, so the odds were stacked against him quite heavily. Although there was only that one loss on his name at this point, there wasn't any wins on his record that made you think that this fight was going to be that competitive, especially considering he mainly fought at 135 pounds, so this timing can get a 5.5. Pacquiao was just a clear level or 2 above in this fight. His jab was also on point, which is a very underrated asset of Manny's. The difference in speed was ridiculous. Rios couldn't keep up in the slightest. I'd give this performance a solid 10. This gives an average of 7.16 out of 10. I've already rated Juan Manuel Marquez in my Mayweather resume deep dive, and I was teetering on giving him either a 10 or a 9.5, but I feel like he's missing just that one extra great win to get full marks, so he gets a 9.5 for level. This was the 4th fight between Pacquiao and Marquez, with Pacquiao already winning 2 of the 3 fights. Pacquiao had also already fought at welterweight for a few years at this point, whereas Marquez had only fought at that weight against Floyd and the 3rd fight against Manny, which was actually a catch weight of 144 pounds. And because Manny had already beaten Marquez at a lower weight, not many expected Marquez to beat the bigger man at a higher weight. Out of the 4 fights between them, this is the one that was probably favoured to Pacquiao the most, and it's actually the only one he officially lost. It's a difficult one to judge, but I'll give the timing of this fight a 7. I do love Manny, but there was a bit of satisfaction when Pacquiao got put to sleep in the 6th round, because it was the least that Marquez deserved after the 3 fights they already had. The fight was so close up until the stoppage, but when you get put to sleep like that, the performance can't get any more than a 2. This gives an average of 6, but because he lost, this number gets halved, so the actual average is 3 out of 10. Timothy Bradley again, who has a level of 8.5. This is the first fight between the 2 of them. Bradley was moving up in weight from super lightweight to welterweight to fight for Manny's WBO belt. He had fought at welterweight before, but his best wins were definitely at super lightweight. Oddsmakers had Bradley as a massive underdog, and this was a very big upset, whether you think Bradley won or not, so I'm giving the timing a 6.5. Now, I get that some of Pacquiao's work may not look the cleanest sometimes, but how on earth the judges gave this to Bradley is something I'll never understand. It's not quite the same level robbery as Josh Taylor against Jack Catterall won, but for the most part, I thought Pacquiao was landing the cleaner shots and the heavier shots at a more consistent rate. I thought this was a good performance by Pacquiao, but the judges clearly didn't. I'd give this performance a 7.5. This gives an average of 7.5, but because he lost, this number gets halved, so the actual average is 3.75. Marquez again, who we know has a level of 9.5. This was the 3rd fight between Marquez and Pacquiao, and other than his losses against Mayweather and Pac himself, Marquez was on a generational run for about 5 or 6 years, but he was basically moving up 2 weight classes at this point, as he mainly fought at lightweight, but this fight was at welterweight. Plus, we had already seen that Marquez wasn't very competitive against Floyd at welterweight, so I'll give this timing a 7. Now, like I said for the second Bradley fight, all of the Marquez fights, other than the 4th one, were all very close fights, but that doesn't mean that the performances weren't great by either of them. It's actually the opposite in my opinion. I think Pacquiao and Marquez both performed extremely well in the first 3 fights, and exciting fights tend to have a better performance rating even if they are competitive. You can argue either way about who won this fight and you'd be right both times. Marquez had a lot of success, Pacquiao had a lot of success. I think this performance deserves an 8.5. This gives an average of 8.33 out of 10. I've also already ranked Mosley in my resume deep dives of Canelo and Floyd. He's a Hall of Famer, 2 wins against Oscar De La Hoya and some other great wins against elite fighters. Mosley is definitely a 10 for level. Mosley hadn't won for 2.5 years at this point in his career, his last win being against Margarito in 2009, so I'm not really sure how he was fighting for Manny's WBO belt. This wasn't a prime Mosley, but he still did have some success later in his career against Pablo Cesar Cano and Ricardo Mayorga. With that being said, Pacquiao was a heavy favourite, so the timing of this fight can get a 6.5. Mosley didn't look great, but he still had that nuclear left hook, he still had the experience, Manny dominating him from start to finish. He showed a lot of respect to Mosley here, I feel, and if he really put his foot down, he could maybe have got the stoppage. Much faster and sharper than the older man of Mosley, pretty much a shutout victory that I'd give a 9 for performance. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. Antonio Margarito, in my opinion, is a disgrace to the sport of boxing, but I'm going to judge his resume and his ability in an unbiased manner. Margarito was a great boxer at welterweight and was virtually world champion for about 7 consecutive years. He was just in a stacked era with elite fighters like Cotto, Pacquiao, Shane Mosley, Paul Williams, so he's not quite top level, but still an extremely talented fringe elite level fighter. He's still a scumbag though, and he only really had success in one weight class, so he can get an 8 for level, and even that might be too lenient. Margarito is coming off the win against Roberto Garcia, but Shane Mosley had already stopped Margarito a year and a half before this, and this is also after the controversy with the Miguel Cotto fight. This fight against Pacquiao was actually at a catch weight of 150 pounds, so Margarito definitely had the advantage, and this was Pacquiao's first time fighting at super welterweight when he was barely even a regular welterweight. It could have been a very tough matchup for Pacquiao, so I'm giving this timing a 9.5. This is one of the most beautiful performances of Pacquiao's career, and it might just be because I despise Margarito, but this was such a satisfying wash? Not a wash. Do enjoy a nice satisfying wash though. It was just a pummeling from start to finish. The combinations Pacquiao was throwing and the angles he was shifting off at were just a chef's kiss. This performance is a 10 all day for me. This gives an average of 9.16 out of 10. Joshua Clottey seems like a bit of a forgotten man. He did win the IBF belt at welterweight against an old Zab Judah, and he also holds a win against an old Diego Corrales, but when fighting the better guys in the division like Margarito, Cotto and Pacquiao, he seemed to fall short, but most people usually will, so that's no shame. Clottey can get a level of 6.5. Clottey had just lost against Miguel Cotto the year before this, but prior to that he was on a very decent streak with his wins against Judah and Corrales, as well as being a seasoned fighter at welterweight, which Pacquiao was not yet. The fight against Cotto showed that Clottey was a very capable fighter and could definitely cause some problems for Pacquiao, so I'd give this timing an 8.5. This was a shutout win for Pacquiao, and Clottey didn't really have any success, but you wouldn't call it an amazing performance from Pacquiao, as it was quite a boring fight, which doesn't really make any sense because Manny threw a total of 1,231 punches in the fight, which was a record for him at the time, and it still might be a record for him, I'm not entirely sure. You'd think a shutout win would get you close to a 10 for performance, but something felt just a little bit off, and it definitely wasn't one of Manny's better fights, so I'd give this performance an 8. This gives an average of 7.66 out of 10. I'm sure everyone knows my feelings towards Miguel Cotto at this point. If I had it my way and I was being completely biased, I'd definitely give him a 10. One of the most exciting fighters you can find and also has some great wins to go along with it. I think a 9.5 is fair. Cotto only had one loss on his record at this point, and which was against Margarito, which does it really count? I mean, I don't think so. This was Pacquiao's first proper fight at welterweight, and he was fighting one of the best in the division, so this was a crazy fight to take at the time. And this is almost against what you'd consider a prime Miguel Cotto, but I personally feel that Cotto's prime was possibly a couple years before this, but really you're just splitting hairs at this point, so I think this timing deserves a 10. Pacquiao didn't just beat a legend of the game, he beat him, hurt him, dropped him and stopped him. This was an incredible performance against one of the best fighters in the world at the time. This performance can't get anything less than a 10. This gives an average of 9.83 out of 10. Ricky Hatton obviously has that fantastic win against Kostya Tszyu, and he does have some good wins against Luis Collazo and Jose Luis Castillo. There is a British bias that surrounds Ricky Hatton though, in my opinion, which makes you feel like he's better than he actually is. He's still a legend of British boxing, and as you know if you saw my Mayweather deep dive, Ricky Hatton gets an 8.5 for level. Although Hatton had lost to Mayweather a year and a half before fighting Pacquiao, that was at welterweight, which he wasn't very comfortable at, and the fight against Manny was at super lightweight, which better suited Hatton. Not to mention that Hatton was also the IBO champion at this point, so Manny was fighting for Hatton's belt. I would argue that the Mayweather loss took quite a bit out of Hatton, but he still managed to become world champion again after this, so I'll give the timing of this fight a 9. You will never see a bigger beating over the course of 6 minutes than you will in this fight right here. Hatton was outclassed in every sense of the word. Pacquiao's feet were faster, his hands were faster, he was stronger, he hit harder. This was a devastating knockout against another fighter that was considered one of the best in the world at the time. And not to sound like a broken record, but this performance gets a 10 as well. This gives an average of 9.16 out of 10. Oscar De La Hoya didn't have loads of fights for a Mexican, but what Oscar achieved in his short-ish career is quite incredible. Wins over Felix Sturm, Arturo Gatti, Ike Quartey, 2 wins against Julio Cesar Chavez, Hector Camacho, Pernell Whitaker. In my opinion, De La Hoya's level is an easy 10. This was the last fight of De La Hoya's career, and he was well out of his prime at this point, despite not being incredibly old at the age of 35. Oscar had lost 3 of his last 6 fights before fighting Manny, albeit against elite opposition like Mayweather, Hopkins and Mosley. I'd give the timing of this fight a 6. Pacquiao was getting off the first punch and the last punch of every exchange. The speed discrepancy was massive and Manny boxed incredibly. He beat De La Hoya into submission, which is arguably more impressive than knocking him out. You might think I'm taking the piss now with my scores, but anyone who has watched and lucky enough to live through this era of Pacquiao knows that he was unbeatable at this time and is maybe the greatest boxer of all time. So this was also a 10 out of 10 performance. This gives an average of 8.66 out of 10. David Diaz holds a win against the great Erik Morales, but other than that, you're struggling to find another good win on his record, so Diaz can have a 5.5 for level. Although Diaz wasn't the greatest fighter, he was champion at the time, and Pacquiao was moving up in weight to lightweight from super featherweight, so this was a decent challenge for him, fighting the champion at a new weight class. Plus, this was the best run of Diaz's career, so he was definitely in his prime, so he can get a 10 for timing. We all know that Pacquiao's combination punching is possibly some of the greatest of all time, but the way he was throwing head body head throughout the entire fight was genuinely mesmerising. Diaz didn't win a single round and his face looked like he'd been put through a blender by round 6. I said the same thing in my Mayweather resume deep dive about one of his fights, but when Pacquiao fights against someone that is clearly a level below like he did here against David Diaz, it really makes you appreciate how truly incredible he is. Sorry if I'm being repetitive, but this performance also gets a 10, the 4th consecutive 10 for performance. What a joke. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. Marquez again, who we've established is a level 9.5 fighter. This was their second fight, the rematch from their draw a few years prior. This was virtually Marquez at his best in my opinion. He had recently beaten Barrera the year before to become champion at super featherweight, and this fight was for Marquez's belt, so this timing gets a 10 from me. I could say the exact same thing here that I said about the third Marquez fight. It was super entertaining and either fighter could have won. Manny knocked Marquez down in the 3rd round, which ended up being decisive for Manny to get the decision. It wasn't without its hairy moments though, because Manny got rocked a couple of times himself. What a performance from both of them. I'd give this performance from Pacquiao a 9. This gives an average of 9.5 out of 10. Marco Antonio Barrera is obviously a legend and his resume is great, but I remember it being better. Obviously, he's best known for those wins against Erik Morales, and he does also hold wins against Prince Naseem as well as a win against an old Kevin Kelly, but I feel like I just remember his resume being more stacked than it is. But more than likely, I think I just fused Barrera and Morales' resumes together in my head. So I feel a fair score for Barrera's level, a 9. As I said a moment ago, Barrera had just lost to Marquez before this, but prior to that loss, he was on a fantastic run as super featherweight, with his only other loss over the course of 7 years being against Manny Pacquiao in 2003. Because Pacquiao had already beaten him in the past, it doesn't make this timing a 10, but it's pretty close, so I'll give it a 9. Barrera did better in this fight than he did in their first fight. He managed to time Manny coming in and he tried to box smarter as opposed to going to war. This didn't stop this from being a pretty one-sided fight though, with Manny landing well over double the amount of punches. This win in my opinion deserves an 8.5 for performance. This gives an average of 8.83 out of 10. Jorge Solis very rarely fought outside of Mexico. He never became world champion, falling short on 2 separate attempts. The only person on his resume that he's beaten that I actually recognise is Miguel Roman. So for that reason, Solis gets a 4.5 for level. This fight was a pretty poor matchup, especially for Pacquiao standards. Not only did Solis have no good wins going into the fight, but he was also moving up in weight. It sounds like an absolute death sentence to me. I'm not sure why this fight was made, so this timing gets a 3.5. Pacquiao struggled in the first few rounds to let his combinations go, mainly due to Solis keeping the fight at distance with his much longer reach. The power punches started raining down from the 5th round, and it seemed like every shot that landed was rocking Solis, and it was only a matter of time until Manny knocked him out in the 8th round. I'd give this performance a 9.5. This gives an average of 5.83 out of 10. Erik Morales is another legend of the game. Him and Barrera are synonymous with one another, and it's too hard to separate them. Morales was basically unstoppable at super bantamweight and only really lost when he moved up in weight and he got older. Even though he got old young, he wasn't even 30 yet when he started to fade, but his early years were just title defense after title defense after title defense. But like I said, him and Barrera are inseparable, so Morales also gets a 9 for level. This was the third fight between Morales and Pacquiao, with it being one win apiece. Morales' win was the first fight, which was a close, exciting decision, and Pacquiao won their second fight, which was a conclusive stoppage win 10 months before this one. So Pacquiao was definitely the favourite for the third fight. Still, Morales was a game opponent, and it was the decider from a trilogy, so it just made sense to make. The timing gets a 9. Now this is how you end a trilogy that is currently at one win apiece. Manny invested into the body early to slow Morales down. He used Morales' aggression against him and wobbled him multiple times and then dropped him when Morales was on the retreat. It was only round 3, but Morales had already taken such a beating that he basically quit while sat on his arse. You already know what score this gets. It is obviously a 10 for performance. This gives an average of 9.3 out of 10. Oscar Larios isn't actually someone I was familiar with. His name just doesn't ring a bell, so you can call me a casual if you want, that's fine. Larios had a very dominant period between the early to mid 2000s at super bantamweight where he held the WBC title. The quality of wins I'm not so sure about because they're all against people I've never heard of. It's a difficult one for me to rate because I'm not willing to try and spend hours watching footage just to see that his resume tells me his whole career perfectly anyway. So going off his achievements, I'll give him a level rating of 5.5. Larios was coming off a knockout loss in the 3rd round against Israel Vazquez and then jumped up 2 weight classes for this fight against Manny, so this was a really strange matchup where Manny would have been favourite by a mile. I'll give this timing a 4. Larios had some success early on in this fight when he was keeping the fight at distance, but as the fight progressed and Larios slowed down, Pacquiao was able to get in close and let his hands go. It seemed like Pacquiao couldn't miss with his straight backhand. Obviously he wasn't able to get the stoppage, but there was a couple of knockdowns. All in all, it was still a very dominant performance from Pacquiao, one that I'm going to score an 8.5. This gives an average of 6 out of 10. Erik Morales again, who obviously has the level rating of 9. This is the second fight between them, and as I already said, Morales had won the first one, so he would have been very up for this rematch and actually went into this fight as the slight favourite. So if Pacquiao was an underdog, you have to give this timing a 10. There were some shaky moments for Pac-Man at the start of this fight, but every time he got hurt, he banged his gloves together and kept pushing forward. This was another action-packed fight, and you wouldn't expect anything less from these two. Morales slowed down at the midway point, and Manny's intensity saw him grab the fight by the scruff of the neck and put a beating on Morales, forcing referee Kenny Bayless to stop the fight in the 10th round. A great revenge moment from their first fight. This performance deserves a 9. This gives an average of 9.33 out of 10. Hector Velasquez has not had a good career in the slightest. The first half of his career is him beating up tomato cans, and the latter half of his career is being the tomato can for other people to beat up. He somehow fought for a world title a couple of times and obviously lost pretty miserably each time. Velasquez gets a 3.5 for level. This was a complete mismatch. Velasquez hadn't fought anyone and didn't stand a chance here. This was likely a mini rebuild for Pacquiao, having lost against Morales the fight before. Nonetheless, Pacquiao had fought much better opposition than this at this point, and he was by far the better fighter. Horrible mismatch, this timing gets a 2.5. This fight started somewhat competitive, but I think it's mainly because a lot of people think they can hang with Pacquiao's level of intensity, which he can usually keep for like 12 rounds. He can probably keep for about 15 rounds, and they can only keep it for about 3, and then they gas out, and that's exactly what happened with Velasquez here. He started good, firing back, and then he slowly wilted down to nothing. Manny was using Velasquez's head as target practice in the 6th round. Eventually, the referee stopped the fight after the bell had already rang to end the round. I'd give this performance a 9. This gives an average of 5 out of 10. Erik Morales again, who obviously has a level of 9. This was the first fight of the trilogy between them, and Pacquiao was considered the favourite here, likely because Barrera had already beaten Morales twice and then Pacquiao had beaten Barrera, so I think it's natural for people to think Pacquiao would be the favourite. But obviously boxing isn't that black and white. I'd give this timing an 8.5. You could say this about 10 fights on Pacquiao's resume, but this first fight with Morales was one of the greatest fights of all time, in my opinion of course. I'm pretty sure both fighters got hurt in each of the 12 rounds. Although Manny lost this fight, he still put on a good performance. With that being said, Morales was the worthy winner in my opinion. He landed the cleaner shots and he seemed to do it more frequently. Pacquiao did get a nasty cut by an accidental clash of heads midway through the fight, which possibly hindered him quite a bit, but that's not something I can really put a numerical value on. I'd give this performance a 6.5. This gives an average of 8, but because he lost, this number is halved, so the actual average is 4. Narongrit Pirang almost exclusively fought in Thailand, and the level of opposition was abysmal to say the least. He won the IBF Pan-Pacific Super Bantamweight title, which isn't saying much looking at the people he beat. I reckon I could probably have won it if I didn't weigh 65 pounds too much. Pirang gets a 2.5 for level. Pirang was another easy opponent for Pacquiao, but it was an IBF eliminator, so that kind of explains why this fight took place, but it doesn't stop it from being a one-sided mismatch in which Pacquiao was a clear favourite, as Pirang had fought nobody. The timing can get a 3.5. There's not much to say about this. Manny beat the brakes off of him for about 10 minutes and then absolutely flattened him. He didn't put a foot wrong, so for that reason I can only give this performance a 10. This gives an average of 5.33 out of 10. Juan Manuel Marquez again, and obviously he has a level of 9.5. This was the first fight of their quadrology, and yes, I did have to look that word up. This was before Marquez was known as being a solid fighter, but he was already champion at featherweight, but his bigger fights were a few years after this. Pacquiao had better wins at this point too, and he was held as the favourite for this reason. Because it wasn't a prime Marquez just yet, and Pacquiao was favourite, I'd give this timing an 8. Pacquiao started this fight lightning hot, dropping Marquez 3 times in the first round, but somehow Marquez, like the dog he is, turned this fight around and turned it into an absolute war. The speed of Pacquiao was obviously a problem for Marquez, so he started investing into the body from round 3 in an attempt to slow him down, and it definitely seemed to work. It was a great game plan by Marquez, and it could potentially have taught Pacquiao a lesson that you can't just go out all guns blazing every single time. Clearly from his other fights, he didn't learn anything from this because he went all guns blazing in every other fight in his career, and I don't think it did him much harm, did it? If you ignore the first round, you would say that this would have been a comfortable points decision for Marquez. I do feel like Marquez won this fight and he definitely executed the better game plan, so I'm going to give Pacquiao's performance in this fight a 6. This gives an average of 7.83, but because it was a draw, this number is reduced by 33%, so the actual average is 5.22. Marco Antonio Barrera again, who obviously has a level of 9. This was the first Barrera fight, and let me tell you, Barrera at this point in his career was absolutely elite. His 5 fights before this were against Prince Nassim, Enrique Sanchez, Eric Morales, Johnny Tapia, and Kevin Kelly. I don't think I need to say anything more than that. This timing gets a 10. Pacquiao systematically destroyed a living legend in Barrera here. You couldn't give Barrera a single round. Manny looked relentless and seemed like he could have fought 24 rounds that night with no issues. The volume and intensity was an absolute joke, and Barrera's corner rightly threw the towel in, so this performance gets another 10. It's boring, I know. This gives an average of 9.66 out of 10. Emmanuel Lucero, similar to Pirang and Velasquez, is not a good opponent in the slightest. His best win is against Frankie Archuleta. You might have heard of him, but probably not. Not much to go on here, so Lucero can get a 3 for level. Lucero is undefeated, but like I already said, he hadn't really beaten anyone, and Pacquiao was already a multiple weight world champion at this point. Obviously not a household name yet, but much more seasoned against higher caliber opposition, so this timing gets a 4.5. This was a bizarre fight because Lucero basically fought so crouched down that his arse was virtually touching the floor. I know it was a 3rd round stoppage for Manny and he didn't really do anything wrong, but good lord, this was odd. Just really, go and watch it. I can't really justify this score, but the performance gets an 8. This gives an average of 5.16 out of 10. Seriksan Yeshmagambatov was fighting debutants in his 30th fight, which tells you all you need to know. He can get a 2 for level. I also have no idea how he secured this fight against Pacquiao. This was up at featherweight instead of Pacquiao's usual super bantamweight fights at the time. Maybe Manny was just testing the waters against bigger fighters. Even so, it wouldn't tell you much because Yeshmagambatov is horrible matchmaking, so timing gets a 3. It would have been lower if it wasn't for moving up in weight. Manny actually got dropped in this fight in the 4th round, and in fairness, it was a pretty heavy shot as well. He did well to recover from it. If you've seen my videos before, you know that I like it when people get knocked down and then get back up to win. Although it was against someone who he really shouldn't have been knocked down by, I don't include that in the performance rating because it's already taken care of in the level criteria and the timing criteria. Pacquiao got the stoppage in the following round after he sent Yesh Magomedov flying across the ring twice. I'd give this performance an 8. This gives an average of 4.33 out of 10. Preya Sawayngam is the same story as Yesh Magomedov. The quality of opposition is seriously horrible. In his 48th fight, he fought a mystery opponent because his apparent scheduled opponent was a North Korean guy, but the guy that showed up wasn't him, so he was just a random bloke, and he only just won a close points decision, so he gets a 2 for level. His record was impressive at the time, but when you look deeper, you find out that in the fight before the Pacquiao fight, Sawayngam fought someone with a record of 0-2-1. And it's not even documented how many rounds this fight was supposed to be. He was a former WBF World Bantamweight Champion, which is a belt now held by Prince Patel, so you can decide how prestigious that title is. These are the sort of opponents Pacquiao would have been fighting prior to his breakthrough fight against Ledwaba, and he really should have been fighting better people here. So this timing gets a 3.5. I didn't count it, but it seemed like Sawayngam got knocked down with the first punch that Manny landed, and the fight didn't last much longer than that considering it was a first round KO. A nice easy punch perfect performance that gets a performance level of 10. This gives an average of 5.16 out of 10. Jorge Julio won the WBO belt at bantamweight in 1998 and defended the belt a couple of times. This division wasn't as stacked as it is nowadays, mainly due to fans not being interested in lower weight classes back then, so there wasn't many high quality fighters due to the pay not being great either. Julio can get a 5 for level. Julio was at the end of his career, but he had at least fought against decent opposition in the past, like Junior Jones and Johnny Tapia, so there is some experience there, so this fight was an okay progression fight, but one that Pac was still expected to win comfortably, so I'll give the timing a 6. Manny dropped Julio in round 2 with a big straight backhand and jumped on him and swarmed him until the ref stopped the fight. Truly faultless, the performance gets another 10. This gives an average of 7 out of 10. Agapito Sanchez fought some of the legends like Marquez, Barrera and obviously Pacquiao himself. Lost them all, but there's no surprise there. Sanchez also managed to win a world title at super bantamweight because all the better guys moved up in weight at that point. Sanchez can get a 5 for level. Sanchez had just won the WBO title at bantamweight, so this fight was actually a unification fight because Manny had the IBF title. Sanchez was also on a decent streak, albeit against pretty poor opposition, but because this was back-to-back title fights for Manny, I'll give this timing a 7.5. This was Pacquiao's first fight at Top Rank, and this is likely to be a night to forget for Manny, not for anything he did in particular, but Sanchez made this fight rough and scrappy. He hit Manny with multiple low blows and really should have been disqualified because he was getting to a point where it was just negligent from the referee. There were also multiple headbutts, which isn't unusual for Pacquiao fights considering he is southpaw, often fighting orthodox boxers, and he lunges in quite a lot. The fight was stopped in the 6th round because of cuts caused by headbutts, so it went to the scorecards at the time and was subsequently declared a draw. Pacquiao usually likes rough fights, but he wasn't enjoying this fight at all. I do believe that if the fight carried on, he probably would have won, but I can only score the performance on what actually happened and what I actually saw, so this performance gets a 5.5. This gives an average of 6, but because it was a draw, this number is reduced by 33%, so the actual average is 4. Leila Ledwaba was a decent champion at super bantamweight, defending the belt in the UK, USA and South Africa. Ledwaba was considered the best South African in the world at one point in his career and deserves a level of 6.5. Manny took the fight on 2 weeks' notice, and it was the first time that Manny and Freddie Roach were working together. Pacquiao was a complete unknown at this point, so much so that the commentary team was struggling to pronounce his name. I can't find the official odds, but Ledwaba was rumoured to be around a 7-1 to 10-1 on favourite, so this timing can absolutely get a 10. This would have been most people's first time watching Manny, and if it was, you would have been thinking that this guy was not human. This was not only a dominant beating, but it was also a masterful display of boxing skill, a truly spectacular performance to put Manny Pacquiao into the mainstream media. This performance gets another 10 from me. This gives an average of 8.83 out of 10. Boonsai Sangsarat turned pro in 1997 and later won the WBC World Flyweight title in 1999 against Pacquiao. He lost the world title 9 months later and never made any attempt to win the world title again despite fighting for 11 more years. In his one attempt at fighting in the States for a Latino bantamweight title, he got stopped inside of a round. I'd give Sangsarat a level of 5.5. Boonsai was a knockout artist, and the betting odds that I found suggest that he was also the favourite in this fight against Pacquiao, despite Manny being on an incredible run himself. The split was 70% to 30% in favour of Sangsurat, and Sangsurat was the one challenging the champion, so it shows that he must have been a terrifying proposition at the time, so the timing of this fight can get a 9.5. Pacquiao was feeling the effects of Sangsurat's power from the very first bell. He must have got hurt early because he was on his bike from the very start. In the third round, Manny got dropped by a straight to the body and folded like a deck chair. By far Pacquiao's worst fight of his entire career, this performance gets a 1. This gives an average of 5.33, but because he lost, this is reduced by 50%, so the actual average is 2.66. In terms of flyweight, you could say that Chatchai Sasakul was a very solid one. He was world champion and lineal champion, winning the belt against one of the great flyweights in Yuri Orbachikov. Putting a number on what sort of level he was at is a difficult one because he's almost exclusively stayed at flyweight and super flyweight. Plus, can you say he's achieved more than someone like Timothy Bradley? I mean, I don't think so. I think his achievements align more with the likes of Brandon Rios, but ability wise it's evident that he's far above this, so I'd give Sasakul a 7.5 for level. Sasakul was on one hell of a run, obviously beating Orbachikov like I already mentioned, and then defending his belt 2 times against what you consider decent opposition. Sasakul was a Thai fighter, and this fight was in Thailand. Obviously, with Manny being Filipino, he was considered the B-side in the eyes of virtually everyone, and no one knew what he was actually capable of back then because he had fought virtually nobody. Without hesitation, this timing gets a 10. Pacquiao dominated Sasakul pretty much from the start until the knockout in the 8th round. Manny was pushing Sasakul back all night and forcing him onto the back foot, which Thai fighters aren't usually comfortable with. But when you have the power that Manny carried at that weight, you can push anyone back. This was a great performance that I think deserves a 9.5. This gives an average of 9 out of 10. Now that we've gone through all of the fights, we can see that Pacquiao's best fights are the second Morales fight, the third Morales fight, the second Marquez fight, the first Barrera fight, and the Cotto fight. And it's no surprise that Pacquiao's worst fights are all losses: the first Bradley fight, Ugas, the fourth Marquez fight, Sangsurat, and Horn. Now if we take a look at all the averages, the average level of Pacquiao's opposition is 7.04, the average timing of the fights is 7.49, and Pacquiao's average performance is 8.09. Now for the part you've all been waiting for, the official results. And I can confirm that Manny Pacquiao has received a consistency score of 6.80, which is pretty much middle of the pack really. He's ahead of Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, but behind the rest of them. When you've had 41 fights, it is very difficult to stay consistent though, so this isn't a massive surprise, and he does have quite a few losses on his record. Pacquiao does lead the way on the longevity scoreboard, which again isn't a massive surprise because he has had the most fights, but he is ahead by quite a distance. And if we look at the overall scoreboard, we can see that Pacquiao has got the crown. He's beaten Floyd Mayweather to the top spot. It's a close one though, it's not that definitive. I suppose it's a matter of what do you prefer? Do you prefer Floyd's unbeaten run, or do you prefer Manny's 8-weight world champion status? It's one of those, isn't it? Thank you so much for getting this far and watching all the way to the end. If you don't mind liking, commenting, subscribing, and let me know who you want me to do a resume deep dive on next.